Under a sky ripped apart by savage storm clouds and the mournful cries of the wind, Caleb Ward rode his weathered horse along a cracked, dusty trail near the Snake River in the Wyoming Territory, 1881. The land stretched desolate and broken. Parched earth split by deep crevices, sparse scrub clinging to survival, and a horizon blurred by sorrow. Caleb, a struggling rancher haunted by the memory of a lost family and the weight of his own failures, bore the scars of grief in every weary step. His once thriving homestead now lay in ruins, every sagging barn and splintered fence a testament to a life that had slipped through his calloused fingers. That same morning, after a brutal storm had battered the land into a dismal state, Caleb's sharp eyes caught sight of a most unexpected vision by the riverbank. Amid the rushing, mud-choked waters of the Snake River, partly concealed by shattered debris and half-submerged planks, lay a solitary figure. As his horse trotted closer, he discerned the faint outline of a woman, her frail body strewn on slick rocks, her head bowed in exhaustion, and her once fine dress now ragged and drenched. Even more heart-wrenching was the glimmer of vulnerability in her eyes and the subtle swell of her belly hinting at new life. Though nearly lifeless, the woman's quiet dignity shone through the grime and blood staining her skin. In that harrowing instant, Caleb felt a surge of compassion mingle with the fierce determination to act. The sight of someone so vulnerable amid such desolation struck him like a rebuke to his own despair. Without a moment's hesitation, Caleb spurred his horse forward. He dismounted at the river's edge, the mud sucking at his boots as he knelt beside the dying widow. "Hold on, ma'am," he murmured, voice thick with both urgency and sorrow. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, careful not to jostle her fragile frame. Her skin, cool and clammy from the rain, bore small cuts and bruises, and a few deep gashes ran along her wrist where a rough rope had bitten into her flesh. Clutched in her trembling hand was a faded kerchief, a remnant of better days, and in her glassy eyes the silent plea for mercy shone through. With an inner resolve born of his own losses, Caleb decided at that very moment that he would save her no matter the cost. He guided her to an old, battered wagon parked near a broken fence, a relic from his once prosperous ranch that now barely endured the hardships of a frontier plagued by drought. In the grim light of a clearing storm, Caleb wrapped a threadbare blanket around her shivering form and lifted her gently onto the wagon's bed. Every hoofbeat that carried him away from the river echoed the pulse of his determination and quiet defiance against a fate too cruel to accept. As the wagon rumbled along the dusty trail, the anguished landscape blurred into a backdrop for a single, resolute mission: to preserve life where death had long reigned. By the time Caleb reached his rundown ranch, a cluster of weathered wood and memories slowly crumbling with each passing season, the weight of the day's events pressed heavily upon him. Within the dimly lit parlor of a small, creaking cabin, he laid the dying woman onto a splintered cot and kindled a feeble fire in a rusted iron stove. As the flames flickered against rough-hewn walls scarred by time, he tended to her wounds with a steady, almost ritualistic care. In the quiet that followed, her labored breaths and soft groans spoke of agony and desperate hope. It was then that she stirred enough to murmur her name, Lila Grayson. The sound, fragile yet determined, sent a ripple through the silence and kindled a spark of tenderness in Caleb's battle-hardened heart. In between slowly fading moments, Lila managed to confide broken words that revealed the bitter truth of her plight. She whispered of a cruel fate that had befallen her, of a disastrous encounter where her husband, slain by ruthless men while trying to protect her honor, left her alone and stripped of hope. Even more devastating was her revelation that, in the chaos of that dreadful day, her two small children had been lost in the wilderness. The names, Nora and Sam, were barely audible as they escaped her trembling lips, but they carried the weight of a sorrow so deep that Caleb's resolve only grew stronger. His own solitary existence, marred by the haunting absence of a family he once cherished, resonated with her grief. Here, in this staggering moment of shared vulnerability, fate had intertwined their lives. As the rain began to taper off into a quiet drizzle and thunder faded into a distant murmur, Caleb's calloused hands gently pressed a clean cloth against Lila's wounds. The warmth of the small fire and his steady presence offered a modicum of relief amid the overwhelming darkness of loss. He watched her eyes flutter briefly open, a faint glimmer of trust igniting in their depths. "You're safe here," he assured her softly, his voice steady despite the ghosts of his own past. "I promise I'll do all I can to help you and bring your children back." His declaration filled the silent room with an unspoken vow, a promise that even amid ruins, hope could be rekindled. Yet, as night deepened and a fragile calm lay over the struggling homestead, Caleb's mind churned with the unyielding knowledge that their path to redemption was only beginning. He stared out through a grimy window at the swaying shapes of distant junipers beneath a starless sky and wondered how many lives had been torn apart by sorrow and violence. For him, losing his family had been a wound that time had only dimly healed, and now, seeing Lila, so battered by fate yet clinging to life, he felt the stirrings of a purpose long dormant. "In the shadow of my grief, I found a home worth fighting for," he whispered to himself, the words echoing like a prayer within the silent walls. As the first tentative glimmers of dawn began to pierce the darkness, signaling the end of a long, harrowing night, Caleb's determination hardened. He resolved that come morning, he would ride out into the wild, unforgiving landscape to search for Lila's lost children, Nora and Sam. Their reunion, he believed, was the only way to restore the hope that had been so mercilessly shattered. With the dying woman resting hopefully, Caleb rose from his cot, his eyes set with steely determination as he prepared for the journey ahead. The winds outside had calmed, yet the promise of a new day stirred the barren land into reluctant life. In that quiet pre-dawn uncertainty, as shadows faded and the first light spilled meekly over the broken earth, Caleb stood at the threshold of his ruined ranch. His mind raced with the enormity of his undertaking. To risk everything he had left in order to bring together a fragmented family born of tragedy. Though his heart remained heavy with the weight of past failures, the spark of hope burned ever brighter within him, a beacon guiding him through the darkness of loss. With one final, determined glance at Lila's peaceful face, he secured his weathered rifle to his side and stepped out onto the dew-laden porch. The journey to reunite the lost children beckoned, and as the nascent light of dawn slowly warmed the world, Caleb Ward mounted his horse, ready to ride into the unknown. His silhouette, framed by the fragile light and the crumbling remains of his homestead, promised defiance in the face of despair. The barren frontier, etched by hardship and sorrow, would soon witness the rebirth of hope, a hope born on the wings of a man determined to forge redemption from the ruins of his grief. As dawn breaks over the desolate plains, Caleb sets out to find Nora and Sam, the lost children of Lila Grayson, igniting the beginning of a journey that may yet restore what was once broken. Caleb Ward rode hard through the remnants of the storm, his steeds' hooves churning thick mud along the narrow trail that wound through a forest of gnarled pines. The forest, still reeling from the wrath of nature, was filled with twisted limbs and dripping foliage. Every branch and root testified to the recent tempest that had battered the land. Caleb's eyes, determined and alert beneath a furrowed brow, scanned the horizon through the rain-washed gloom. His heart, still heavy with the memory of rescuing Lila Grayson from near death by the Snake River, beat with the promise to restore what had been so cruelly shattered. Today, that promise took a new form. He had vowed to find her lost children, Nora and Sam and reunite this broken family. The trail was a muddy labyrinth, each step weighted with the hardship of the frontier. Caleb pressed forward, following faint tracks and muffled cries that hinted at life hidden among the fallen logs and underbrush. As he advanced deeper into the storm-ravaged forest, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin. The echoes of the wind, now soft but persistent, mixed with his measured breathing. Every so often, he paused to peer into shadowed clearings where the muddy trails wound between ancient trees, their branches stretched out like silent sentinels over the lost wilderness. Amid the oppressive gloom, Caleb's keen eyes caught a small set of footprints, tiny and rapid, unmistakably those of children frightened and on the run. Steering his horse closer to a copse of scraggly trees, Caleb dismounted with practiced caution. The horse snorted and flapped its ears as if sharing his anxious vigil. He moved slowly along the edge of a small clearing, carefully examining the muddy ground where footprints trailed off into dense undergrowth. It was there, behind a fallen log partially hidden under tangled briars, that he found them, two small figures huddled together, trembling in the shelter of ferns. Nora, with wide eyes and tangled hair, clutched a makeshift doll, while Sam, no more than a boy with solemn, determined features, peered at Caleb with a mixture of fear and hope glimmering in his gaze. They were scared and hungry, yet unmistakably alive. Relief and compassion surged in Caleb's chest as he knelt down before them, speaking in a soft, steady tone. "I'm Caleb Ward. I've come for you," he murmured reassuringly, extending a gentle, calloused hand. The children exchanged a hesitant glance before slowly taking his hand, their small fingers trembling. The reunion was as fragile as it was miraculous. With utmost care, Caleb guided Nora and Sam back along the muddy trail to his rundown ranch. The journey back was quiet except for the soft patter of rain and the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. As they emerged from the forest edge, the battered form of the ranch came into view, a cluster of sagging wooden buildings and a creaking cabin, dimly lit by the gray light of early dawn. Mara, Lila Grayson, awaited them by the door with a mixture of hope and anguish in her tear-streaked face. When Caleb rejoined her with the children in tow, the moment was electric with unspoken relief and tender sorrow. Lila fell into trembling embraces with Nora and Sam, her grief momentarily washed away in the overwhelming joy of reunion. Caleb watched them with quiet satisfaction, even as the weight of their shared past remained unspoken between them. Later that day, after settling the children in a dry corner of the ranch and offering them warm water and simple bread, Lila and Caleb sat by a modest fire in the parlor. The flames cast dancing shadows on the worn wooden walls, and the quiet sound of the fire mingled with the steady drip of rain from a leaky roof. Lila's eyes, still red from tears, met Caleb's as she began to share more of her tragic past. In a soft, hesitant voice, she recounted the horrors that had led her to be cast adrift. "My husband," she whispered, "was killed by a band of ruthless men working for a cattle baron. They wanted to silence him. He knew too much about their crooked deals and their cruelty. When he died, they took everything, and I was left with nothing but pain." Her voice wavered as memories of her lost love and broken promises cascaded in her tone. "They hunt me still, afraid that I might speak of what I witnessed," she added, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "In the shadow of my grief, I found a home worth fighting for, but I've had to pay dearly for every scrap of dignity I cling to." Caleb's gaze hardened with quiet determination as he listened. His own loneliness and scars, accumulated over years of striving against the harsh realities of the frontier, resonated with her loss. "We're together now," he said, his voice solid and reassuring. "I promise you, I will protect you and your children. Our home may be run down, but to start, a place where we can rebuild and find a future far from those who wish you harm." His words, both tender and resolute, drew a faint smile from Lila, as if in that vulnerable moment a spark of hope had been newly lit. "In the shadow of my grief, I found a home worth fighting for," she echoed softly, accepting his vow as both a benediction and a promise of retribution. For a few precious hours, the borders of pain and hope blurred as the newly reunited family began to settle. Nora and Sam played quietly in the corner, while Lila wrapped them in gentle arms and murmured lullabies of a forgotten past. Caleb worked to mend a broken chair, while his thoughts drifted to the looming perils that still threatened their fragile peace. The storm had passed, but the memory of its destruction lingered not just on the land, but in every heart that had seen loss. Outside, as the weak morning light filtered through sparse clouds, Caleb peered across the ranch's boundary. His intuitive gaze, honed by years of isolation and hardship, caught sight of a distant column of dust rising steadily along the horizon. The sound of hooves, faint yet determined, echoed across the vast plain toward his homestead. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that riders were approaching, mounted men whose presence spoke of a relentless threat. These were not mere vagabonds or lost souls wandering the frontier. They were most likely agents of the cattle baron, the same ruthless figure responsible for Lila's tragic loss. The cattle baron's men, still embittered by the secrets they desperately guarded, would not rest until they had reclaimed Lila and silenced any chance of retribution. As Caleb's protective instincts surged anew, his heart beat in time with the ominous sound of distant hoofs. The riders, silhouetted against the awakening sky, cut a menacing figure on the horizon, a harbinger of trouble that now loomed perilously close to their newfound sanctuary. Caleb slowly strode out onto the creaking porch of his ramshackle ranch, pausing as he surveyed the distant riders. The clearing sky promised a day of unyielding light. Yet in those powerful shadows, he sensed the undeniable warning of impending danger. He knew that their respite was precarious, and that the battle for the safety and future of their fragile family was only just beginning. With a measured breath heavy with resolve, he turned back inside, his mind already racing to devise a plan to defend them from the relentless pursuers. His protective vow to Lila and her children was now a burning commandment etched into his very soul. As the murmur of the riders grew louder and more insistent, Caleb's eyes met Lila's across the small, humble interior of the cabin. In that silent exchange, a deep understanding passed between them, a pledge that no matter what storms might come, they would face them as one. "I'll get ready," he promised in a low, firm tone, the weight of his determination reflected in every word. "We'll do what we must to keep you safe." In the gathering light of the new day, as the echo of hooves and distant voices began to swell, the fate of the family hung in a delicate balance. Their reunion was merely the first step of a long, arduous journey, one that would see them confronted by ruthless enemies determined to extinguish every spark of hope. And now, with the riders drawing ever nearer to the horizon, the threat of the cattle baron's pursuit loomed like a dark storm on the edge of their sanctuary. As Caleb stands watchful on his creaking porch, the silhouettes of riders darken the horizon, a menacing portent that the cattle baron's wrath is about to descend upon them. The pale morning light crept slowly over Caleb Ward's rundown ranch, casting long shadows across the creaking porch and dusty yard. The storm had passed, leaving a damp ambiguity in the air and a promise of revival. In the quiet aftermath of chaos, Caleb gathered his new family, Lila Grayson and her two rescued children, Nora and Sam, for what he hoped would be the beginning of a new life. The events of the previous day had been harrowing, but now, as soft light broke over the horizon, a sense of fragile hope mingled with determination. It was in that tender, uncertain dawn that Caleb made a decision born of both protection and love. Sitting beside Lila on a splintered wooden bench under a spreading juniper, he gently took her hand. "Lila," he said, his voice low and earnest, "in the face of their wrath, I chose a family worth defending." His words, simple and resolute, resonated with both the weight of past sorrows and the promise of future redemption. Lila's eyes, red-rimmed and weary, flickered with uncertainty and cautious hope as she listened. She knew that without a legal bond, her safety and that of her children would forever hang by a thread in this wild, unforgiving land. Caleb had a plan. Not only would their bond unite them as family, but it would also offer the protection of the law against those who sought to harm Lila. She had been hunted by a ruthless cattle baron's men ever since her husband was killed by their cruelty, and every day held a new threat. And now, with the dark silhouettes of riders already spotted near the ranch in the early light, Caleb realized that time was short. With unwavering resolve and tenderness born of his own losses, he proposed, "Marry me, Lila. Let our union be the shield that keeps you and these precious children safe." For a long, suspended moment, only the soft whisper of the wind through the pines answered. Then, through teary eyes tempered by a newfound determination, Lila murmured, "Yes." Her words, fragile as they were, broke the silence like the first light scattering the remnants of night. With that quiet pledge, their fates merged, marking the start of a union that would be built on mutual protection and shared redemption. That same morning, under a makeshift arch of wildflowers and old rope stretching across the creaking porch, a simple frontier ceremony was held. A circuit preacher, thin and weathered by years of wandering the back roads of Wyoming territory, led the service. His voice, gentle yet clear, filled the humble space as he pronounced Caleb and Lila husband and wife. The sunlight caught on a crudely fashioned wedding ring, an old band of silver polished by the years and passed down through Caleb's kin, which gleamed as if blessed by the very light of hope. Nora and Sam, clinging to each other and to Lila's skirts, watched with a mixture of wonder and tentative relief. In that moment, amidst the dusty yard and the chorus of low murmurs from a few well-wishers, the family felt united against a world that had, until then, only delivered pain. But even as the newlyweds embraced and tried to share in a brief celebration, the uneasy tremor of impending danger pressed at the edges of their joy. Caleb's eyes, ever watchful, had caught a disturbing sight earlier, riders drawn to the horizon like dark omens. Now, as the ceremony ended and they turned to face the day, a deep rumble vibrated the air. In the distance, where the early sunlight struggled to break through the lingering haze of storm-soaked clouds, a dust cloud began to rise. The horses of a small band of riders kicked up clods of dirt as they approached the ranch with determined speed. Their figures, those of men cloaked in rugged attire and grim expressions, grew sharper against the clearing sky. Every hoofbeat was an echo of threat, every shouted command a reminder that the cattle baron's wrath was not far behind. Caleb, holding Lila's hand as if it were his last tether to hope, immediately shifted his focus from celebrating to defense. "We must be ready," he said with quiet urgency, his gaze following the advancing riders. "They're coming to take her back, take her away from us." Lila's face, still flushed from the ceremony and tears of both sorrow and relief, hardened with determination. Despite her grief and the weight of past traumas, she resolved that she would no longer be a victim. "I will not be taken again," she declared softly, echoing an inner promise that she had long thought lost. With little time to spare, Caleb set about organizing the small defenses of his ranch. The once dilapidated barn and crumbling fences, relics of a past grandeur, were hastily reinforced. The family and a few trusted neighbors brought old tools and makeshift weapons, a scattering of pitchforks, a couple of rifles, and even a heavy shovel to positions along the yard. Every creaking board and rusted nail was transformed into a symbol of defiance. As Caleb directed the setting up of watch posts and guarded doorways, he kept his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon where the dust cloud thickened into a foreboding mass. The tension built steadily as the riders drew closer. The ranch's clearing, once a place of fragile celebration, now became a field of looming danger. Shadows stretched across the creaking porch, mirroring the grim determination etched on the faces of those preparing to defend their newfound family. Caleb's voice rang out as he issued orders. Lock the doors, position the rifles, and be ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of attack. His tone was tempered by a resolute calm that belied the fury he felt for those who sought to terrorize Lila and her children. Meanwhile, Lila, standing beside her new husband, allowed herself a brief moment of reflection while watching Nora and Sam huddle close together in the corner of the cabin. Memories of her husband's brutal death at the hands of the cattle baron's men surged in her mind like a dark tide. Yet, in that reflection, she also found strength, a resolve built on overcoming the cruelty of the past. In the shadow of my grief, I found a home worth fighting for, she whispered, her voice resolute even as tears glistened in her eyes. Caleb squeezed her hand in silent affirmation, their bond deepening with every shared heartbeat. As the final preparations unfolded, the riders' approach became unmistakably imminent. The distant clatter of hooves grew louder, and the silhouettes of men on horseback emerged through gaps in the wilderness. A single rider, his face hidden beneath a weathered hat, was spotted among them, riding with a purpose that sent chills down Caleb's spine. The men were not simply lost wanderers, but emissaries, undoubtedly sent by the ruthless cattle baron to reclaim Lila or silence her forever. The oppressive tension of the moment was punctuated by the harsh sound of a distant bugle, a signal of impending conflict. The horizon darkened as more riders appeared, and clouds of dust mixed with the pale light of dawn, obscuring the line between hope and despair. With his heart pounding like a war drum and every nerve alight with determination, Caleb took a deep breath. He gathered Lila close once more, looking firmly into her eyes. "We'll stand together," he vowed, his voice echoing across the trembling ground. "We have little, but our unity is our strength." The resolve in his tone was unwavering, a promise that resonated with every soul gathered on the battered porch of the ranch. Even as the sound of the approaching riders grew into a roar, the couple managed a fleeting smile, a fragile beacon amid the storm of uncertainty. In that defining moment, as the cattle baron's men neared and the dust rose like a dark curtain upon the ranch, the future of their newfound family hung by a tenuous thread. The riders' presence cast long, menacing shadows across the land, and the threat of violence loomed ever larger. With the sounds of hooves pounding the earth and the distant flicker of torches beginning to punctuate the horizon, Caleb knew that their defense would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Their small home, filled with the echoes of a desperate wedding and the promise of protection, now braced itself for the wrath to come. As the riders' silhouettes coalesce and torches begin to flicker against the rising dust, Caleb and Lila stand poised, ready to face the cattle baron's relentless threat as it draws ever nearer. The gray sky trembled with the distant echoes of hooves as the cattle baron's men poured toward Caleb Ward's rundown ranch. The air was thick with tension, and every gust of wind sent shards of dust swirling around the creaking wooden structures. From the far end of the property, the riders, clad in worn leather and mounted on formidable steeds, moved like a dark tide, their torches throwing vicious, flickering light against the battered walls. Caleb, his eyes narrowed with grim determination, stood on the porch alongside his new wife, Lila Grayson. Just moments earlier, The man who had once threatened to tear their family apart was now at the door of survival, and the stakes had never been higher. As the first salvo of gunfire sparked against Weatheredwood, Caleb and Lila hurried inside to rally their defenses. Outside, the sharp crack of rifles mingled with the pounding of hooves, and the sound of desperation stung in the cool air. Neighbors soon came to aid. A gruff, salt-of-the-earth farmer named Hank, whose calloused hands and steady gaze had seen many a frontier battle. Hank arrived with his battered plow and a couple of old rifles slung over broad shoulders. His arrival a welcome reinforcement against the ruthless attackers. "I've got your back," he snarled, his voice low and resolute, as he quickly took his position by the sagging barn door. Inside, the atmosphere was one of frenetic preparation. Caleb directed Nora and Sam to crawl behind furniture and lock the doors, while Lila, though still trembling from both shock and recent trauma, squared her shoulders and took signal from Caleb to help secure the back entrance. The ranch's defenses were modest. A collection of overturned tables, a scattering of old farm tools, and a row of creaking wind chimes tied on ropes to alert them to any breach. As the first bullets whistled past, the improvised barricades proved their worth, deflecting stray fire and delaying the enemy's advance. On the front porch, the clash of conflict became a maelstrom. Hank and Caleb positioned themselves together, their rifles trained on the advancing riders. Every explosion of gunfire lit the rugged facade of the ranch for a split second, revealing the grim expressions of cattle barons' men who advanced with ruthless precision. Dust rose in thick clouds beneath the relentless barrage. In the glow of the intermittent flame of a lantern and the bright glare of muzzle flashes, Lila appeared resolute. Staring out into the chaos, her tear-streaked face was transformed by determination as she recalled the horrors of her past, the death of her husband at the hands of these very men, and now found herself a warrior in her own right. "From the ashes of my fear, I rose to fight for us," she whispered hoarsely, more to herself than anyone else, her voice merging with the roar of the assault. Before long, the attackers surmounted the initial line and pressed closer. The air vibrated with tension and the sharp retort of gunfire that bounced off the corrugated tin roof of the barn. Caleb, leaning on his worn rifle, directed Hank in repositioning a fallen wagon to block a side entrance. Every maneuver was executed with measured urgency, for the slightest miscalculation could spell disaster. Nora and Sam watched from behind a fractured window, their small faces pressed in terror, yet clinging to hope as they witnessed their mother and father fighting with courage far beyond their years. The battle raged on in fits and starts, a violent skirmish built of desperate charges and resolute holds. Caleb's voice rang out repeatedly, giving orders over the cacophony. "Steady now. Keep your fire," he shouted, and his words bolstered even as they dripped with the stress of imminent danger. Hank's presence provided steady backup, and together they managed to hold back the encroaching tide of the cattle barons' men for a few precious minutes. The defenders' bonds, forged by shared hardship, shone through as they fought side by side under a blue sky, where every gunshot and burst of muzzle flash underscored their unity. In the fierce crescendo of the clash, a particularly well-aimed shot from Caleb sent one of the attackers sprawling. The man tumbled to the ground, his revolver skittering across the dirt, and as he hit the earth, a blood-stained envelope fluttered away from his limp hand. Lila, who had by now moved out from the safety of the house to assist in the defense, noticed the envelope caught in the swirling dust. With a determined gasp, she stooped to retrieve it. The paper was stained red with fresh blood, its edges frayed and muddy, but inside were neatly penned letters and ledgers, a meticulous record of the cattle barons' nefarious crimes. It was damning evidence, detailed accounts of blackmail, cattle rustling, and even orders for unspeakable violence. Lila's hand trembled as she held the evidence, and for a long, suspended moment, the terror of her past threatened to overtake her. She shut her eyes, recalling the anguish of witnessing her husband's brutal end at the hands of these ruthless men. But then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted her chin. "I won't let them win. I will not be their pawn," she declared, her voice steadying as the firelight danced over her determined face. Caleb came to her side quickly, gently taking the envelope from her hand. "We must get this to someone who can expose their crimes," he said, his voice a mix of urgency and quiet resolve. "This evidence will be our weapon against them." His words resonated with a promise not only to Lila, but also to the wider community that had long suffered under the cattle baron's tyranny. As the attackers began to pull back in the chaos that now seemed to shift in their favor, Hank signaled that reinforcements might still be on the way and that the men had retreated to regroup momentarily. The brief lull in the assault allowed Caleb and Lila to tend to the wounded and secure their defenses. Yet, the victory was tempered by a lingering dread. Caleb knew that the cattle baron was not one to accept failure, and this skirmish might only be the harbinger of a greater threat. Standing on the porch, as the echoes of recent gunfire faded into an eerie silence, Caleb scanned the horizon. The first hints of dawn were beginning to tint the sky, but among the soft pastels, he noticed a crisscross of movement. Far in the distance, through the lingering haze of dust and steam from the shaken earth, a letter, a blood-stained letter now clutched by fate, had given them a grim new direction. Carefully, Caleb unfolded it with cautious eyes. The handwriting was ornate yet brutal, laying out the cattle baron's next ambush plan, a coordinated strike aimed to crush any defiance and reclaim Lila by force, once and for all. The details were chilling. A description of hidden ambush points, the expected arrival time of more riders, and a promise of ruthless retribution if Lila was not returned to their dominion. Lila's eyes met Caleb's as she glanced over the letter's contents, her face etched with the raw pain of her memories and the clarity of her resolve. "I must face this," she murmured, more to herself than to him. But even as she spoke, a quiet strength began to replace the tremor of fear. Caleb reached out and squeezed her hand, his expression fiercely protective. "We will fight this together," he vowed. "You're not alone anymore. From now on, our home is ours to defend." Their unity, born amid hardship, served as a potent counterpoint to the threat looming in the letter. But even as they steeled themselves for the next challenge, the sound of distant hooves returned, a relentless reminder that time was running short. The cattle baron's men, now reinvigorated and regrouped, were gathering once again on the horizon, their torches flickering in shadows stretching long over the land. In that fraught moment, as the remnants of battle settled into a tense silence and the first light of a bruised morning began to reveal the scars on the ranch, Caleb and Lila exchanged determined looks. The evidence they had secured was not just proof of cruelty, but a promise that justice could prevail. And though the threat of an ambush still loomed large, they knew that their family, however fragile, was no longer powerless. With hearts pounding in unison and a renewed sense of purpose, they prepared to send word to the nearby town. They understood that in this harsh frontier, survival meant fighting together against tyranny. The letter's ominous contents etched a stark reminder in their minds. The cattle baron had not yet finished, and the next wave of his men would soon descend upon the homestead. In those final moments before the impending onslaught, Caleb's voice was steady as he declared, "We stand ready. I will not let this terrible man ruin what we have rebuilt. Not today." As the sun's first rays illuminated the ranch with a pale, hopeful glow, the distant sounds of the cattle baron's men swelled once more. The threat was not over. Far from it. Now magnified by the desperate ambush plan outlined in the blood-stained letter. The oncoming riders signaled that the cattle baron's wrath was about to descend with renewed force, setting the stage for the ultimate test of survival, family, and redemption. As a renewed assault draws near and the riders' torches flicker menacingly on the horizon, Caleb and Lila brace themselves for the ambush that will decide their fate. The ambush had grown desperate in the twilight, but Caleb Ward's determination shone like a beacon amidst the chaos. In a flurry of rifle smoke and shouted orders, Caleb and Lila, with Hank and a handful of brave neighbors, turned the tide by capturing one of the enemy scouts. The wiry man, hands trembling as he was pinned against the splintered fence by Caleb's steady rifle, but offered up his words in a stuttering confession. His voice, laced with fear, revealed that the blood-stained letter they had recovered earlier was no idle threat. It detailed the cattle baron's final, ruthless ambush plan aimed at capturing Lila and wiping out any hint of her defiance. With the enemy scout in custody, Caleb's eyes blazed with a mix of anger and resolve. "This letter will be our call to arms," he declared, hefting the damning envelope as if it were the very key to their salvation. Word spread quickly among the gathered townsfolk that had rallied at the ranch. The evidence of the cattle baron's treachery ignited a fire of rebellion that began in hushed conversations and grew into bold, determined plans. Lila, though still trembling from the ordeal and the vivid memories of her late husband's brutal end, stepped forward as a natural leader. The sight of her, standing tall with a fierce glimmer in her eyes despite her fragile condition and expectancy, inspired even the most downtrodden. "I will not cower anymore," she proclaimed in a voice that resonated with the promise of vengeance and hope. "We will stand together and push back the tyranny that has haunted us for too long." In that moment, her declaration became a rallying cry for the frontier community, a promise that no one's suffering would be in vain. Caleb wasted no time. He sent a trusted messenger on horseback to the nearby town with the incriminating letter, urging the people there to rise up against the baron's despotic reign. As the messenger raced along muddy trails under the fading night sky, Caleb turned his attention back to the battle at hand. The cattle baron's men, refusing to relent, surged forward again. Horns blared and shouts rang out as the attackers pressed their assault. Gunfire erupted in bursts that lit the battered porch and splintered barn in intermittent, stark light. Yet the defenders, emboldened by their unity and the promise of justice, held every line. Hank and several of the ranch's men flanked Caleb, while Lila directed nervous but resolute hands to reinforce doorways and secure the few remaining weapons. Amid the deafening clamor of battle, the horizon bore witness to other signs of community resistance. At first light, lanterns and makeshift torches had been raised in the town square, their flames reflecting a collective anger toward injustice. The rallying call that had been sent out hours before now bore fruit, as a contingent of townspeople, farmers, shopkeepers, and drifters alike, marched toward the ranch, prepared to confront the cattle baron's forces. Their faces, set in grim determination, were illuminated by the rising smoke from the clash on the ranch. Every explosion that rocked the defenses sent plumes of fire and uncertainty into the cool night air, while the steady rhythm of hooves and distant shouts testified to the enemy's persistence. In one particularly fierce burst of fighting, Lila seized upon the chaos to confront the personal demons that had tormented her for so long. As an enemy gunman fired wildly near her, she dove to the ground and, in a moment that seemed to suspend time, she recalled the grim memory of her husband's final agonized scream, a sound that had haunted her dreams. For a brief, agonizing instant, fear and grief threatened to overtake her. But as she lay there, blood and rain mingling on the worn wooden floor, she found that same spark of defiance that Caleb had seen in her eyes that morning. Slowly, determinedly, she rose to her feet and rejoined the fight. With trembling hands steadying a rifle, she shouted, "I will end their tyranny. I will avenge my past." Her voice, clear and unwavering, rippled over the battlefield and stirred the hearts of those around her. The sight, an expectant bride turned warrior, became the symbol of hope that many needed to see. In that moment, she embraced not only her own inner strength, but also her role as protector of this newly forged family. The battle, though fierce and unyielding, began to tilt in favor of those fighting for justice. As the enemy's numbers dwindled under the combined might of the ranch defenders and the reinforcements from town, the cattle baron's men began to retreat in disorganized clusters. The captured scout was led away as evidence of the baron's cruelty, and his murmured words about an imminent further ambush fueled the determination to never relent. Caleb rallied his forces for one final push along the perimeter, forcing the remaining attackers back with controlled volleys and a barrage of improvised explosives. Slowly but surely, the tumult subsided into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the ragged breaths of the wounded. After the battle, the air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and spent gunpowder, and smoke curled lazily from ruined fences. The community, beaten but unbowed, began to gather around the ranch. In the days that followed, with the cattle baron's power visibly broken and his men scattered, the mood shifted from tension to hope. A promise of renewal echoed in every determined glance and every calloused hand that began to rebuild. Caleb and Lila, standing side by side, led the efforts to patch up the battered homestead. Neighbors brought fresh planks of wood, and the once-ruined barn was slowly pieced together. Each nail hammered a testament to their newly forged unity. Soon, the small ranch began to take on the semblance of a thriving homestead, a beacon amid the rugged wilderness. In the warmth of that new day, Lila found solace in a quiet corner of the rebuilt main cabin. With nimble fingers and focused determination, she began to set up a small sewing workshop in what had once been simply a storage room. Under the careful guidance of a kindly neighbor, she mended old clothes and fashioned new garments, a small but significant act of reclaiming her past and rewriting her future. The rhythmic sound of a steady needle punctuating fabric became a symbol of renewal. Nora and Sam, no longer the frightened, isolated children of yesterday, now laughed and played in the yard, a reminder that even amid strife, life could find a way to flourish. As a few weeks passed, the ranch grew stronger, bolstered by community effort and an unwavering spirit of defiance against past oppressions. Caleb, once a solitary figure haunted by his failures, emerged as a pillar of strength and hope. His leadership not only revitalized the homestead, but also sparked a broader movement among the townsfolk, who saw in his triumph a path toward a more just frontier. Lila, now confidently running her modest sewing workshop, became a respected figure in the small town. Her transformation from a grieving widow to an empowered matron symbolizing the resilience of the human spirit. In quiet conversations around a newly built fire pit, neighbors spoke of their renewed hopes. From the ashes of our struggle, we built a legacy of love, Caleb would say, echoing a sentiment that resonated with each healed scar and every mended memory. Yet, even as life began to settle into a rhythm of renewal, a lingering dread persisted in Caleb's mind. The blood-stained letter that had revealed the cattle baron's ambush plan was a grim reminder that the enemy was still at large. Late one evening, as the homestead slept beneath a canopy of brilliant stars, Caleb pored over the letter by lamplight, tracing the dark script with roughened fingertips. The document detailed another, more extensive ambush, a plan designed not only to reclaim Lila, but to crush the burgeoning hope of all who dared defy the cattle baron. The threat was clear. The baron would not rest until his reign was restored by force. As the first blush of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a gentle glow on the new wooden planks and freshly tilled earth, Caleb stood on the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. Beside him, Lila watched with equal resolve, her hands busy arranging fabric bundles in her workshop window, a symbol of creativity and hope amid lingering dangers. Their children, Nora and Sam, played in the soft light, unaware of the heavy burdens their parents carried, yet embodying the promise of a brighter future. In that hopeful calm, the ranch unified not only as a family, but as a community, a resurgence born from defiance against tyranny and forged through shared sacrifice. Their days were now filled with hard work, laughter, and plans for a future where injustice might be met with unyielding courage. However, even as they celebrated their hard-won victories, the memory of that menacing letter loomed like a dark specter on the edge of their newfound peace. Caleb's heart pounded as he glanced at the horizon once more, alert for any sign that the cattle baron's merciless forces might return. For now, hope reigned supreme. The ranch stood as a testament to survival and redemption, an enduring legacy carved from heartache and fueled by love. With every sunrise that warmed the scarred land, with every shared smile and determined glance, Caleb and Lila reaffirmed their promise to conquer the darkness of their past. Their lives, intertwined by fate and fortified by community, had blossomed into something greater than mere survival. The promise of a legacy built on courage, unity, and the enduring power of love. If this tale of grit and love moved you, subscribe for more Wild West adventures.